The dealer looked Margaret Holloway in the eye and delivered a verdict that nearly stopped her cold. $200,000. 8 luxury SUVs. 8 identical fault codes. And according to the dealership, every single vehicle needed a major electronic module replacement. Most people would have signed the estimate and moved on. Margaret didn't. Instead, she called a mechanic the dealership had fired 18 months earlier, the same man who had warned them about this exact problem and paid for it with his career. That night, Ryan Cole stood alone in a small repair shop, staring at a tiny part worth just $14. What happened next exposed a truth no one expected. Ryan Cole wasn't the kind of man people noticed. If you walked past Cole Auto Repair on Halsted Street in Chicago, chances were you wouldn't even glance at the building. The faded sign above the entrance had survived too many winters. The garage door rattled every time it opened. The waiting room was barely large enough for 3 chairs, and an old coffee machine that worked only when it wanted to. Yet every morning, before the city fully woke up, Ryan was already there. At 6:45 sharp, he unlocked the side door, stepped into the cold garage, and began the same routine he had followed for nearly 2 years. Lights on, heater running, toolboxes checked, work orders reviewed. There was something comforting about repetition. After everything life had taken from him, routine was one of the few things that still belonged entirely to him. 18 months earlier, Ryan had been one of the most respected diagnostic specialists at Vance Prestige Auto Group, one of the largest luxury vehicle service centers in Illinois. Back then, he worked on Bentleys, Porsches, and McLarens worth more than most people's homes. Now he spent his days repairing family sedans, pickup trucks, and delivery vans. Most people would call that a fall. Ryan never did. Because there was one thing nobody understood. The size of a paycheck didn't determine whether you could sleep at night. His old job had paid better. His current life felt cleaner. That didn't mean it was easy. Far from it. The shop survived month to month. Some weeks were good. Others forced him to calculate every expense twice before spending a dollar. And then there was Grace, his daughter, the most important person in his life. Ever since his wife, Diane, passed away, Ryan had learned to balance 2 full-time responsibilities at once. He was a mechanic, and he was a father. There were mornings when Grace sat quietly in the waiting room doing homework, while Ryan worked beneath a vehicle lift. There were evenings when he finished repairs long after sunset, only to return home and help with school projects before midnight. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was the life he had, and he never complained about it. That November morning looked no different from hundreds before it. The sky above Chicago was gray. Snow drifted along the sidewalks. The heater struggled against the cold. Ryan's assistant, Lucas Reed, arrived carrying a backpack and a cup of coffee. 26 years old and eager to learn, Lucas represented something Ryan respected deeply. Honesty. If Lucas didn't know something, he asked. If he made a mistake, he admitted it. In Ryan's experience, those qualities mattered more than talent. They could teach skill. They couldn't teach character. The morning continued quietly until the phone rang. One call, one conversation, one decision, and everything changed. At first, Ryan assumed it would be another customer asking about a repair estimate. Instead, the woman on the other end introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, the founder of Morrison Capital Group, a name Ryan recognized immediately. People like Margaret didn't call shops like his. Their vehicles usually went directly to luxury dealerships, yet there was something unusual in her voice. Not panic, not anger, doubt. The kind of doubt that appears when a person is being told something that doesn't quite make sense. By the time Margaret finished explaining the situation, Ryan was staring at the shop floor in silence. 8 luxury vehicles, 8 identical failures, 1 repair estimate, $200,000, and somehow, every instinct he had developed over 2 decades in the industry was telling him the same thing. Something wasn't right. Very soon, Ryan would find himself facing the company that had fired him, the executive who ignored his warnings, and a secret buried deep inside a luxury dealership service department. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't always come from the biggest company, the loudest expert, or the most expensive solution. Sometimes the answer is found by the one person willing to ask a simple question that everyone else ignored. And Ryan Cole was about to ask exactly that question. Margaret Holloway was not a woman who frightened easily. Over 3 decades, she had built Morrison Capital Group from a small consulting firm into one of Chicago's most respected private investment companies. She negotiated multi-million-dollar deals before breakfast, managed risk for a living, and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees. When people brought her problems, they usually expected her to solve them. What they did not expect was for her to become suspicious of the solution itself. That Tuesday morning, she sat alone in her office on Michigan Avenue, staring at a document that looked perfectly professional. The estimate was detailed. The formatting was flawless. Every part number was listed. Every labor charge was explained. The dealership logo sat proudly at the top of every page. Yet, something felt wrong. 8 Bentley Bentayga SUVs belonging to Morrison Capital's executive fleet had recently undergone scheduled maintenance at Vance Prestige Auto Group. Nothing unusual. The vehicles were maintained regularly and serviced according to manufacturer recommendations. For years, the dealership had handled the fleet without issue. Then suddenly, within 2 weeks of service, all 8 vehicles began reporting identical electronic faults. One vehicle could have been bad luck. 2 vehicles might have been coincidence. 8 vehicles? Margaret didn't believe in coincidences that expensive. She reviewed the estimate again. $25,000 per vehicle. $200,000 total. The proposed repair called for complete replacement of the advanced driver assistance system control modules. According to the dealership, the electronic systems had suffered catastrophic failure. The modules were supposedly beyond repair. Replacement was the only safe option. Most executives would have approved the estimate immediately. After all, the recommendation came from a certified luxury dealership. Who was she to argue with automotive specialists? Yet the more she thought about it, the less the explanation made sense. The vehicles had all been functioning perfectly before service. The failures appeared only afterward. And somehow every vehicle developed the exact same problem at nearly the same time. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Something about the situation reminded her of an old lesson she had learned in business years ago. When the same problem appears everywhere at once, the cause is usually singular. Not multiple failures. One failure, one source, one overlooked detail. Her assistant entered the office carrying another stack of paperwork. "Everything okay?" he asked. Margaret tapped the estimate. "Have you ever seen 8 identical failures happen at the same time?" He shook his head. "Not unless something caused them." Exactly. That answer stayed with her. Not unless something caused them. For the next hour, she reviewed maintenance records, repair histories, and service schedules. Every path led back to the same location, Vance Prestige. The same dealership, the same service visit, the same timeline. By lunchtime, she had made a decision. Before approving $200,000, she wanted a second opinion. The challenge was finding someone qualified enough to question a luxury dealership's diagnosis. She began making calls. Several independent shops refused immediately. Others admitted they lacked experience with Bentley electronics. A few offered opinions but sounded uncertain. Then one name surfaced repeatedly: Ryan Cole. At first, she didn't recognize it, but the more people she spoke with, the more often the same recommendation appeared. If Ryan says it's broken, it's broken. If Ryan says it isn't, ask more questions before spending money. That level of reputation was rare, especially in the repair industry. Curious, Margaret dug deeper. What she discovered surprised her. Ryan had once worked for Vance Prestige itself, not as a basic technician, as one of their lead diagnostic specialists, someone trusted with solving the complicated problems nobody else could figure out. Yet he no longer worked there. No public explanation, no announcement, simply gone. The situation grew even more interesting. Why would a dealership lose one of its top diagnosticians, and why were so many former customers still recommending him? By mid-afternoon, Margaret decided to stop researching and start calling. The phone rang several times before Ryan answered. His voice was calm, professional, unhurried. Margaret explained the situation from the beginning. 8 vehicles, identical failures, $200,000 estimate. She expected skepticism. Instead, Ryan listened without interrupting. No sales pitch, no dramatic reaction, just silence. When she finished, he asked only 2 questions. What fault codes are showing? Margaret read them directly from the report. Then Ryan asked a second question. Did all the warnings appear at the same time? Margaret paused. That detail wasn't listed in the estimate. She checked her notes. Yes, she said. All 14 warning messages appeared simultaneously. For the first time, Ryan stopped speaking. Several seconds passed, long enough for Margaret to wonder if the call had disconnected. Then he finally responded. I'll take a look, nothing more. No promises. No guarantees. No claim that the dealership was wrong. Just 4 words. I'll take a look. Margaret wasn't sure why, but hearing those words made her feel more confident than the entire $200,000 estimate sitting on her desk. Because confidence sounded different when it came from someone who actually understood the problem. What neither of them realized was that this case was about to reopen a chapter of Ryan's life he thought had ended 18 months earlier. A chapter involving buried reports, ignored warnings, and the very people responsible for forcing him out of the dealership. The first Bentley would arrive at his shop before noon, and within minutes of connecting his diagnostic scanner, Ryan would see something that made his stomach tighten. Not because it was unexpected, but because he had seen it before. The first Bentley arrived at Cole Auto Repair just before noon. Even before the flatbed truck finished lowering the vehicle onto the pavement, Ryan felt a familiar sensation settle into the back of his mind. Not certainty, recognition. The silver Bentayga looked flawless. Its paint reflected the gray Chicago sky without a scratch. The tires were nearly new. The interior smelled of leather and expensive detailing products. To anyone standing nearby, it appeared to be a luxury vehicle in perfect condition. Yet according to the dealership's report, hidden beneath that polished exterior was a catastrophic electronic failure worth $25,000. Ryan wasn't interested in appearances. Cars didn't lie. People did. Documents did. Estimates did. But the vehicle itself always told the truth. You simply had to know how to listen. Lucas watched as Ryan connected the diagnostic scanner to the OBD port beneath the dashboard. Think they're right? Lucas asked. Ryan didn't answer immediately. The scanner began communicating with the vehicle's control systems. One by one, fault messages populated the screen. Then more. Then more. Within seconds, 14 active fault codes appeared. Lucas stared. That's a lot. It is. Bad? Ryan leaned closer to the display. Not necessarily. Most technicians saw fault codes as evidence. Ryan saw them as clues. There was a difference. A fault code didn't tell you what was broken. It only told you what the vehicle believed was wrong. And sometimes vehicles were mistaken. The 14 warnings covered nearly every part of the advanced driver assistance system. Forward radar, rear radar, lane departure monitoring, emergency braking, electronic stability control, collision avoidance systems, camera modules, sensor networks. At first glance, the list looked terrifying. Exactly the kind of screen that justified a massive repair estimate. But something bothered Ryan immediately. Every warning belonged to the same electronic family. Nothing else was affected. The engine was healthy. The transmission showed no faults. The suspension system was normal. The braking hardware itself was functioning correctly. Only the assistance systems were complaining. That detail mattered. A lot. Lucas pulled a stool beside him. So what's that mean? Ryan pointed at the screen. If all these systems failed independently, we'd expect other related faults. Lucas nodded. Okay. But look at the pattern. He highlighted several entries. They all depend on the same power source. Lucas frowned. You think it's electrical? I think they're all reporting the same problem from different angles. The younger mechanic looked confused. Ryan smiled slightly. Imagine 10 people in a room suddenly complaining they can't see. The problem could be 10 separate eye injuries, or someone could have turned off the lights. The second explanation was usually more likely, and a lot cheaper. Lucas laughed. That's actually a pretty good way to explain it. Ryan stood and walked toward the rear of the vehicle. His mind had already begun assembling pieces. The same warning pattern, the same system family, the same symptoms, the same cold weather conditions, and most importantly, the same vehicle model. Memories from 2 years earlier resurfaced. A technical bulletin, a report, an ignored recommendation, a conversation he'd rather forget. The deeper he looked into the Bentley, the stronger the feeling became. This wasn't a new problem. Someone had already documented it. Someone had already identified the cause. And someone had decided not to act. The question was whether Ryan was imagining the connection or seeing it clearly. There was only one way to know. Test everything. He opened the rear cargo compartment and removed the floor panel, covering the auxiliary electrical junction box. Rows of fuses appeared beneath. Most mechanics would have ignored them. Luxury vehicle diagnostics often encourage technicians to focus on complex components, control modules, processors, electronic networks, the expensive parts. But Ryan had learned something over 20 years in the industry. The most expensive diagnosis wasn't always the smartest diagnosis. Sometimes $1 million problem started with a $10 component. He connected a multimeter. Voltage looked normal, nothing unusual. Lucas crossed his arms. So maybe the dealership was right? Maybe. Ryan started the engine. The V8 purred to life. Then he waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15. Lucas shifted impatiently. What are we waiting for? Heat. The younger mechanic looked puzzled. Ryan pointed toward the engine temperature reading. Some failures only appear under operating conditions. Another 5 minutes passed. The engine reached normal temperature. Ryan checked the measurements again. His eyes narrowed. There it was. Small, subtle, easy to overlook. The voltage had dropped. Not enough to trigger alarms on its own. Not enough to seem alarming, but enough to matter. Very much enough to matter. He measured again. The reading dropped further. A tiny change. Less than most technicians would consider significant. But Ryan knew better. Electronic systems didn't care what humans considered significant. They cared about specifications. And this number was moving outside them. Lucas looked over his shoulder. That's it? Ryan nodded slowly. That's it. The younger mechanic blinked. Seriously? Seriously. The voltage continued falling as the system warmed. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. Just enough. Exactly enough. Ryan suddenly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago weather. Because he knew what he was looking at now. Not a failed control module. Not a damaged processor. Not a $25,000 repair. Something much smaller. Something hidden. Something he had personally reported years earlier. A component so inexpensive that most customers would spend more on lunch. And if he was right, the entire $200,000 estimate was about to collapse. Ryan slowly reached toward the fuse panel. His fingers stopped above a specific slot. One tiny component. One simple piece of hardware. The same component mentioned in the technical bulletin he had submitted years ago. The same bulletin that had disappeared inside Vance Prestige. The same bulletin that eventually preceded his termination. For a moment, he simply stared at it. Then he looked at Lucas. Get me the thermal probe. Lucas immediately moved. What did you find? Ryan didn't answer. Not yet. Because if he was correct, the next 10 minutes would prove something far bigger than a repair estimate. They would prove that someone had known about this problem long before Margaret Holloway ever walked into a dealership. And if that happened, the story would no longer be about a broken vehicle. It would become a story about a buried truth. And buried truths have a way of costing people far more than money. Chapter 3. The $14 Answer. Ryan carefully connected the thermal probe to the fuse housing and stepped back. The engine continued idling. The shop was quiet except for the soft hum of machinery and the distant sound of traffic outside. Lucas stood beside him, watching the readings update in real time. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The voltage remained within specification. The fuse appeared normal. There were no visible signs of damage, no burn marks, no cracks, no corrosion. Nothing that would immediately explain 14 simultaneous warning messages. That was exactly why so many technicians missed it. Most people trusted what they could see. Ryan trusted data, and data had a way of revealing things that appearances concealed. The engine temperature continued climbing. 160 degrees, 170, 175. Ryan monitored the voltage rail. The number dipped slightly, then dipped again. Lucas leaned closer. "You saw that?" Ryan nodded. "I did." The younger mechanic frowned. "It doesn't look like much." "That's because you're looking at the number." Ryan pointed toward the graph forming on the screen. "Look at the pattern." Another minute passed. The engine reached full operating temperature, and suddenly the voltage dropped below the lower tolerance threshold. Not by much, only a fraction. Yet the effect was immediate. Ryan stared at the reading. There it was. Exactly the same failure signature. Exactly the same thermal behavior. Exactly the same electrical instability. The same one described in the technical bulletin 2 years earlier. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Lucas finally broke the silence. "So the modules aren't broken?" Ryan shook his head. "No." "The sensors?" "No." "The processor?" "No." Lucas blinked. "Then what caused all 14 faults?" Ryan reached into the fuse panel. His finger stopped on a tiny component hidden among dozens of others. He carefully removed it and held it beneath the shop light. A standard fuse, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, worth $14. Lucas stared. "You're kidding." Ryan wasn't smiling because he wasn't joking. The problem that supposedly required $25,000 in parts was being caused by a component cheaper than a family dinner. The fuse hadn't failed traditionally. It hadn't blown. It hadn't melted. It hadn't stopped working entirely. Instead, years of thermal cycling had slowly increased its internal resistance. Cold mornings, hot engines, thousands of operating cycles. Eventually, the fuse reached a point where it still worked, but not perfectly. When temperatures rose, voltage dropped just enough to create uncertainty throughout the vehicle's assistance systems. The processors interpreted that unstable power supply as multiple system failures. The warnings appeared. The sensors reported faults. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, and anyone who failed to investigate the underlying cause could easily assume the expensive electronics were defective. Ryan turned the fuse slowly beneath the light. It looked completely normal. That was what made it dangerous. Visible failures attracted attention. Invisible failures created profit. A thought crossed his mind, one that made his jaw tighten. How many customers had paid for unnecessary repairs because nobody bothered checking this fuse? How many people had trusted an estimate simply because it came from an authorized dealership? How many times had the technical bulletin been ignored? The answer disturbed him more than he expected, because now he knew something important. This wasn't a theory anymore. This wasn't a suspicion. This wasn't a possibility. This was proof. He walked to the parts shelf and retrieved a brand new replacement. Original equipment specification, $14. Less than 5 minutes later, the new fuse was installed. Ryan cleared every stored fault code. Then, he restarted the engine. Lucas folded his arms. Neither of them spoke. The scanner initialized, system by system, module by module. The screen refreshed. Silence. No warnings. No fault messages. No active codes. Nothing. Lucas stared at the display, then looked at Ryan, then looked back at the display. "That's impossible." Ryan shook his head. "No, it's simpler." The younger mechanic laughed. in disbelief. A dealership wanted $200,000 because of this? Ryan didn't answer, not because he disagreed, because he was thinking about something else. The bulletin, the report, the email, the rejection, the termination. A chain of events suddenly seemed much less coincidental. Still, he wasn't interested in assumptions. Only evidence. Evidence wins. Assumptions lose. Every time. Let's verify it, Ryan said. An hour later, he was driving the Bentley through Chicago traffic. Stoplights, intersections, highway speeds, adaptive cruise control, lane monitoring. Every system performed perfectly. When he returned to the shop, he scanned the vehicle again. Clean. He drove it a second time. Clean again. A third test produced identical results. No warnings, no faults, no failures. The $25,000 diagnosis had vanished because of a $14 part. Ryan documented everything: voltage readings, temperature measurements, scan reports, photographs, test drive mileage, timestamps, every detail. By the time he finished, the report left no room for interpretation. Facts rarely needed decoration. Facts only needed documentation. As the sun began setting outside the garage, Ryan finally picked up the phone. Margaret Holloway answered immediately. "I found the problem." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then came the question she had been waiting all day to ask. "How bad is it?" Ryan looked at the tiny fuse resting beside his workstation. Then he answered. It cost $14. For several moments, Margaret said nothing, because some numbers are so different from what you expect that your mind needs time to process them. Ryan knew this conversation was only beginning. What he didn't know was that the report he was about to send would trigger a confrontation with the very people who had buried the truth years earlier. And once that happened, nobody involved would be able to pretend they didn't know. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Have you ever been told an expensive repair was necessary, only to discover the real problem was something simple? Your experience might be more common than you think, because in the next chapter, Ryan's $14 discovery will collide head-on with a $200,000 estimate, and someone powerful is about to realize that an old mistake has come back to haunt them. Ryan spent the next 3 hours turning evidence into a document that could withstand scrutiny. Not a sales pitch, not an opinion, not a theory. Evidence. Every voltage measurement was logged. Every diagnostic scan was attached. Every test drive was documented. The report showed the condition of the vehicle before the repair, during testing, and after the fuse replacement. Nothing was left to interpretation. When Ryan finally reviewed the completed document, it totaled 12 pages. 12 pages that reduced a $200,000 estimate to a $14 solution. Most people would have felt victorious. Ryan didn't. He felt uneasy, because he knew exactly what would happen next. Large organizations rarely welcomed evidence that embarrassed them, especially evidence that cost them money. At 3:47 that afternoon, he emailed the report to Margaret Holloway. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. Margaret had already reviewed the executive summary. "You sound surprised," Ryan said. "I am." "Because of the price difference?" "Because of the confidence." Ryan smiled slightly. The confidence wasn't his. It belonged to the data. Margaret remained silent for a moment. Then she asked the question Ryan expected. "What should I do now?" "Send the report back to the dealership. And then ask them to explain, in writing, how they arrived at a $25,000 repair recommendation." The line went quiet. Both of them understood what that request meant. It wasn't simply a question. It was a challenge. A challenge backed by documentation. An uncomfortable combination. By 4:30 p.m., Margaret forwarded the report directly to Vance Prestige Auto Group. The subject line was short. Professional. Impossible to misunderstand. Within minutes, the report landed in the inbox of Isabella Vance, the company's CEO. Unlike most executives, Isabella had inherited her position rather than building her career through the dealership network. She had assumed leadership 14 months earlier after her father's passing. That meant she had never worked directly with Ryan Cole. In fact, she had never heard his name before. To her, the report was simply another complaint requiring review. At first, she opened the attachment, began reading, and immediately noticed something unusual. The report wasn't emotional. There were no accusations, no threats, no dramatic language. Only measurements, graphs, temperature logs, diagnostic outputs, the kind of documentation created by someone who expected every claim to be questioned. She forwarded the report to Jason Mercer, Director of Service Operations, the same man responsible for the original estimate. Her message contained only one sentence: "Handle this and get back to me by end of day." Jason opened the report minutes later and instantly froze. Not because of the data, not because of the diagnosis, because of the name at the bottom, Ryan Cole. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Then he scrolled upward. Voltaire lux, thermal readings, testing methodology. The structure was unmistakable. He had seen this style of diagnostic work before, hundreds of times, because he had supervised Ryan for 4 years. And now, the one employee he had pushed out of the company had just dismantled a $200,000 estimate with 12 pages of evidence. Jason leaned back in his chair. For the first time all day, he felt genuinely uncomfortable, not because Ryan might be wrong, but because Ryan might be right. And if Ryan was right, difficult questions would follow. Questions about procedures, questions about oversight, questions about decisions made years earlier, questions he preferred not to answer. An hour later, Jason called Margaret Holloway personally. His voice remained calm, professional, controlled, the way experienced executives sound when navigating dangerous situations. He acknowledged the report, complimented its thoroughness, then began introducing doubt. According to Jason, replacing the fuse might remove the warning messages temporarily. However, he argued that the underlying electronic modules could have suffered hidden damage, damage not visible through standard diagnostics, damage that might reveal itself months later, damage that justified replacing the entire system now rather than risking future failure. It was a clever argument, because hidden damage is difficult to disprove. Margaret listened carefully, then asked a simple question. "Do you have documentation proving the modules are damaged?" Jason paused, only briefly, but long enough. No direct documentation at this time. The answer told Margaret everything she needed to know. The recommendation was based on possibility. Ryan's report was based on evidence. Those two things were not the same. Yet Jason wasn't finished. Before ending the call, he introduced something new, something far more serious: warranty liability. According to Jason, because Ryan was not currently affiliated with an authorized Bentley dealership, his repair could potentially affect manufacturer warranty coverage. The implication was immediate. If Morrison Capital allowed Ryan to inspect the remaining 7 vehicles, they might expose themselves to over $1 million in warranty risk. That argument landed exactly where Jason intended. In the boardroom, in the legal department, in the minds of executives responsible for protecting company assets. By 6:15 p.m., Carter Winslow from Morrison Capital called Ryan. His tone was polite, but cautious. The situation had changed. The dealership was now claiming that continuing independent repairs could jeopardize warranty protection on the remaining fleet. Ryan listened quietly, then stared across the shop at the repaired Bentley. Still fault-free, still functioning perfectly, still proving the dealership wrong with every passing minute. When the call ended, Ryan remained alone in the garage, long after sunset. The battle was no longer about a fuse, or a repair estimate, or even 8 luxury vehicles. It had become something much larger. Someone was trying very hard to keep the truth buried. And the harder they pushed, the more certain Ryan became that they were afraid of what would happen if that truth surfaced. What he didn't yet realize was that the next piece of evidence wasn't hidden in a vehicle. It was hidden in a folder he hadn't opened in 18 months. A folder containing 2 emails, 9 words, and proof that this entire story had started long before Margaret Holloway ever made that phone call. Ryan sat alone in the garage long after Lucas had gone home. Outside, Chicago's winter wind rattled the metal siding of the building. Inside, the shop was silent. The repaired Bentley sat beneath the overhead lights, perfectly functional, completely free of fault codes. A $14 fuse had solved a $200,000 problem. Yet somehow, Ryan felt less relieved than before. Because deep down, he knew this was no longer about the vehicle. It was about the past. For 18 months, he had tried not to think about Vance Prestige. He had buried the memories the same way people bury old injuries. Not because they heal, because constantly touching them only causes pain. But tonight, those memories refused to stay buried. Slowly, Ryan walked toward the filing cabinet in the back corner of the office. The cabinet was old. One drawer stuck halfway open. Another required a hard pull. Inside were years of invoices, repair records, tax documents, and customer files. At the very back sat a thin manila folder. Dust covered the top edge. Ryan hadn't touched it since the week he was fired. For several moments, he simply stared at it. Then he pulled it out. The folder contained only 2 sheets of paper, 2 ordinary emails, nothing dramatic, nothing impressive. Yet those 2 pages had the power to destroy everything Jason Mercer had been claiming. Ryan unfolded the first page, the 14th of September 2022. Subject: F-47 thermal failure pattern. Urgent review recommended. Attached to the email was the exact Bentley technical bulletin that explained the failure. The same bulletin connected to the Morrison Capital vehicles. The same bulletin identifying the $14 fuse. The same bulletin Ryan had personally investigated. The same bulletin proving the problem was known years earlier. He turned to the second page. Jason Mercer's response. The 16th of September 2022. Only 9 words. Not applicable to current inventory. Do not escalate. 9 words. That was all. 9 words that had buried the bulletin. 9 words that prevented technicians from checking the fuse. 9 words that may have cost customers hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ryan stared at the page. For the first time since leaving the dealership, something became painfully clear. Jason had known, not suspected, not overlooked. Known. And if he knew, then the entire narrative being presented to Morrison Capital was a lie. The next morning, Ryan began making calls. Not emotional calls, not angry calls, evidence calls. The first went to Bentley Motors North America. After several transfers, he reached Daniel Whitfield, a senior engineer who had worked on the original technical bulletin. Ryan explained the situation. Daniel listened carefully, then asked a few questions. When Ryan finished, Daniel became quiet. Very quiet. Finally, he spoke. "You're telling me they're claiming the modules are damaged?" "Yes." "And they replaced none of the fuses before recommending module replacement?" "Correct." Another pause. Then Daniel sighed. "I can provide written clarification." Ryan felt a small sense of relief. "What kind of clarification?" "The bulletin is official manufacturer guidance." "Good. And replacing the fuse according to the bulletin does not void warranty coverage." Ryan closed his eyes. That single sentence changed everything. Because Jason's strongest argument had just disappeared. An hour later, the signed letter arrived in Ryan's inbox. Official. Documented. Verifiable. Exactly what he needed. Meanwhile, Lucas had spent the night researching something else. Customer complaints, warranty records, public repair databases. By noon, he walked into Ryan's office, carrying several printed pages. "You need to see this." Ryan looked up. "What is it?" Lucas dropped the papers onto the desk. 11 documented cases nationwide. 11 Bentley vehicles showing nearly identical symptoms. 11 module replacements. 11 expensive repairs. And not one record showing inspection of the F-47 fuse before the modules were replaced. Ryan slowly turned the pages. 3 of the cases originated from Vance Prestige. 3. The exact dealership involved now. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The problem wasn't a mistake. The problem was a system that somehow kept producing the same profitable outcome. Expensive module replacements, ignored bulletins, missing inspections. The pieces fit together too perfectly. By midnight, Ryan had assembled everything: the emails, the technical bulletin, the engineer's letter, the repair data, the nationwide records, the volti logs, the test drive reports. Each document reinforced the others. Each fact supported the next. Together they formed something far more dangerous than an accusation. They formed proof. The following morning, Margaret Holloway arranged a meeting. One room, one table, both sides present. No lawyers controlling the narrative from a distance. No carefully worded emails. No filtered summaries. Just evidence. And people. Jason Mercer arrived first. Confident, well-dressed, carrying a thick technical presentation, the kind designed to overwhelm people with complexity. Ryan arrived alone. No attorney, no assistant, no presentation binder, only a laptop, a padded envelope, and one tiny plastic bag. Inside the bag sat a single fuse, worth $14. Jason barely glanced at it. To him, it looked insignificant, meaningless, a trivial piece of hardware. But Ryan knew something Jason didn't. Sometimes, the smallest object in the room carries the greatest weight, especially when it contains the truth. And before this meeting ended, everyone at that table was about to discover exactly how expensive a $14 fuse could become. The room remained silent. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The two emails lay on the conference table beneath the fluorescent lights. One from Ryan, one from Jason, one warning, one dismissal. Between them sat a $14 fuse inside a clear plastic bag. Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing. Yet somehow, it had become the center of a battle involving luxury vehicles, corporate executives, lawyers, warranty claims, and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Jason Mercer looked at the documents, then at Ryan, then back at the documents. For the first time that morning, he appeared unsure of himself. Not because the evidence was complicated, because it was simple. Simple facts are often the hardest facts to escape. A few hours later, the meeting ended without a formal decision. But Ryan knew something important had changed. The conversation was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what had happened. And facts have a way of surviving long after arguments collapse. The following evening, Ryan received a call from Margaret Holloway. Her voice sounded different, lighter, more certain. The internal investigation had already begun. Additional records were being reviewed. More documents were surfacing. And every new piece of information pointed in the same direction. The technical bulletin had existed. The warning had been known. The recommendation had been ignored. Eventually, the investigation expanded beyond Morrison Capital's fleet. Dozens of historical repair records were examined. Patterns emerged. Questions multiplied, and answers became increasingly difficult to avoid. Weeks later, Jason Mercer was removed from his position pending the outcome of the investigation. The decision made headlines inside the company, not because of the amount of money involved, because of what the situation represented. Trust. Customers trust professionals. Drivers trust mechanics. Patients trust doctors. Clients trust advisors. And whenever trust is replaced by convenience, profit, or ego, the damage extends far beyond dollars. Ryan never celebrated the outcome. That surprised many people. After everything that had happened, some expected him to feel victorious. He didn't, because this story was never about revenge. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It wasn't about humiliating an old employer. Ryan understood something many people never learn. Being right doesn't always feel good, especially when being right means discovering how many people were hurt because nobody listened. A few weeks later, the Morrison Capital maintenance contract officially transferred to Cole Auto Repair. The agreement guaranteed steady work for the next year. For the first time since opening the shop, Ryan could stop worrying about whether there would be enough customers next month. A second vehicle lift was installed. New diagnostic equipment arrived. Lucas accepted a full-time position. The business grew. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Just steadily. The way honest things usually grow. One cold Friday afternoon, Ryan sat at his desk finishing paperwork when the side door opened. Grace walked inside, carrying her backpack. Without saying much, she placed a folded drawing on his desk. Then, she went to the waiting area and began working on homework. Ryan unfolded the paper. It showed a small building, a repair shop, 2 garage doors, a sign above the entrance, and beside the building stood a man and a little girl. The drawing wasn't perfect. The proportions were wrong. The lettering was uneven, but Ryan immediately understood what he was looking at. Home, not the house where they lived. The life they had built. The life that almost disappeared when he lost his job. The life that survived because he refused to compromise what he knew was true. Slowly, he folded the drawing and placed it on the shelf above his workbench, beside the old folder, beside the documents that had changed everything. Then, he returned to work. Because that's what people like Ryan do. They keep moving. They keep building. They keep showing up. Long after everyone else has stopped paying attention, years from now, most people involved in the Morrison Capital case will forget the exact numbers. They'll forget the estimate, the reports, the meetings, the arguments. But one lesson will remain. The dealer said the repair would cost $200,000. The actual solution cost $14,000. The difference between those numbers wasn't technology. It wasn't engineering. It wasn't complexity. It was a choice. A choice made by people who assumed nobody would ask questions. And that assumption remained true until one quiet mechanic decided to look a little deeper. The truth didn't win because it was louder. The truth won because it was true. And eventually, reality catches up with every story built on something else. If this story taught us anything, it's that expertise matters, but integrity matters more. Knowledge matters, but honesty matters more. And sometimes, the most valuable person in the room isn't the one with the biggest title, the most expensive office, or the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the person willing to examine the $14 fuse everyone else ignored. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever discovered that a simple truth was hidden beneath a complicated explanation? Your story might inspire someone else to keep asking questions. And remember, the people who change outcomes are rarely the loudest people in the room. They're usually the ones who keep looking when everyone else has already stopped. We'll see you in the next story.